there's been several moments that people have made comments like, "Oh, you're an immigrant? I didn't realize." Or, "Oh, but you're different," right?
Yeah.
And again, those aren't things that in the moment I recognize them for what they are, even though I'm sure they weren't necessarily with malice that they were being said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the individual themselves didn't even realize the weight that it carried.
Yeah.
But looking back on it now, I'm just like, what does that even mean?
Right.
Right? Or I still get asked, "You don't have an Indian accent. Did you need me to have one? Like,
Does that make it safer for you if I say? Yeah.
Why do we need to predefine what this like idea of who and what an immigrant is,
Yeah.
or even a non-immigrant is?"
Right.
Welcome to From Home to Here, where we dive deep into the compelling stories of immigrants and children of immigrants to shift the narrative and break the silence barrier. I'm Shivani Mayave, and I'm joined by Katie Gable, and we are just going to have a nice conversation about how there's not a one-size-fits-all for immigrants and for non-immigrants. So, hi, Katie.
Hey, Shivani.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I feel like we've already started this conversation, and I'm just excited to get a little bit deeper into some of the topics we've been talking about the past few days.
I know, me too. Well, for starters, should I call you Katie or Mary Kate or MK?
Such a great question. Whatever you're comfortable with, but I think that okay, I love MK. Let's go with that. I think that leads us to one of these things that you and I have been discussing, which is unpacking and understanding the power of names. I want to start with you and your name, and tell me the origin story of your name.
Sure. So, Shivani, I was actually named by my grandfather because I was born on Lord Shiva's birthday, Shivratri. And so from that, he derived Shivani. So if you break down my name, Shiva, the Shiva part is in reference to Lord Shiva. And then Ani actually means wife in Sanskrit. So the direct translation is God's wife or goddess. And it's interesting because I've never been embarrassed of my name, but I've also never been like proud of my name. It's just kind of been something that's assigned to me, and I've been fine with it. But I've learned over time, especially in the conversations like we've had, the power that a name holds.
Yeah.
And so I really want you to share your Shulu story of your name and what you recently discovered.
And hearing your story, I just got goosebumps. That's so cool. What power that name holds. And I think for me, kind of also the hope that a family instills and the projection of power that they see in you, that you embody as a result of that name is so powerful too. So yeah, I'm a Mary Kate. I hated Mary Kate growing up. Olsen twin era.
Mary Kate and
That's right. So I would get like, "Oh, are you in Full House? Where's your sister Ashley?" And at first, like, that was funny. It was cute. 15 years down the road, people still sending us things and I never really, it was just a name to me growing up. I didn't understand where it came from, why my mom had really been so intentional about choosing the name she did for me. And then I also got, growing up in a very traditional Catholic house, "Oh, Sister Mary Kate, you're going to be ready to enter the convent." And so it was that joke as well, which, yeah. But it hasn't been really until the past year or two that I've started to embrace the meaning behind my name. So the Mary aspect has been passed down for 5 or 6 generations, as long as I can trace back the genealogy. And it was my mom's side of the family from the Azores. So small little island area belonging to Portugal, but kind of way in the middle of nowhere. So my grandmother's family, they were immigrants to Boston. The women came over alone. They worked in the textile factories, the boot factories outside of Boston. And they just were trailblazers in their own right. And then Kate came from my great-great aunt who actually raised my grandmother. Her mom left America and went back to the Azores and left my grandmother in Boston basically alone. And her aunt stepped in, and she was highly educated for a woman at the time, was an editor in Boston, never married, never had children, but kind of everything my grandmother learned about how to be a strong woman during that time came from her aunt. So I carry those now, and rather than kind of running from it or hiding from it, now I embrace.
I love that. Yeah, I'm curious, why now? What made you want to
Such a great question. Yeah, I
take
think
your name back first and to even learn more about it?
I think for a long time it was just safe to be Katie,
Yeah.
for others. It was about others.
The keyword.
Yep, yep. What made everyone else comfortable. And I even had to adapt. There were a lot of Katies growing up. It was a very common name. So I had to even adapt my name in classrooms where there were a number of Katies. And so I had to kind of shrink myself for others. And I'm discovering now that's not where power lies. Power is in reclaiming the name for myself and what it means for me, and that I can be Mary Kate unapologetically, and all the things that I get to define that as, not what other people project onto me.
Yeah. What's really interesting about what you just shared is that despite being a non-immigrant, you have obviously your family immigrated here at some point in their history, but your story is so relatable to so many immigrant children.
Yeah.
Wanting to shorten their names, Americanize their names, make them more Western so that they feel like they blend in. So whether it's Katie or Mary Kate or, Siddharth and Sid, like you see that in so many immigrant children. And like I said earlier, I was never ashamed of my name, but there was always this moment, especially first day of school, where I knew when the pause came, it was my name that they were trying to read. And Shivani, to me, doesn't seem like a very difficult name phonetically. I think it, sounds just the way it's spelt.
Yeah.
But I've gotten variations that I can't even. Sherman. That was my favorite.
Oh, that is a good one. Yeah,
Sherman. We'll never forget. We had a substitute teacher, and it was anatomy class in my junior year of high school. And everyone's just looking around being like, there is no Sherman in class. And by the end, the only name that hadn't been called was mine. And so I was like, Shivani? Is that what you mean? Shivani? And it was just, as a child, high school age or younger, those moments stick with you because you're pointed out as different.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's why I think I've seen it in my own family. I have family members who have shortened their name to make it easier for others to pronounce or accept.
Yeah.
And it really pains me.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm curious to hear more about your experience kind of navigating the complexities of that, kind of being made hyper visible in a setting which I'm assuming there were mostly white people, but to be kind of made hyper visible in those moments. What was that like for you?
It's interesting because you're right. I was born in India, but spent the first about 9 years of my life in the UK. It's a lot more diverse. Then we moved. And at that age, you're not really cognizant of those things. It's much later in life that I feel like when you reflect that you're like, oh, that was a microaggression, or that probably wasn't appropriate the way that happened. And it wasn't until we moved to South Overland Park, again, predominantly white. And I still didn't get it because I was just like my normal at that point. It actually wasn't until I met my husband a little over 10 years ago that he, being from the Southwest, when he came here, he was very cognizant of certain like microaggressions and just things that from his upbringing and background and the environment in which he grew up, which was more diverse, he immediately like pinpointed as being not okay. And so then when I went back and reflected on certain things, such as this Sherman story, right? Like at the time, I felt like called out as different, but really it was disrespectful.
Absolutely.
You would never mispronounce Shannon,
That's right.
but you couldn't take 5 seconds to just, like, break it down or just, be like, "Hey, could I get some help in pronouncing this name?"
Yeah.
It would have been as simple as that.
Yeah.
And how many children go through that?
Yeah.
So, to answer your question, I didn't really recognize it as for what it was until much later in adult life. So,
And so now recognizing it, what is it like to reflect back on those experiences, and how does that kind of guide your actions and behaviors now?
it makes me sad for not having the power at that time to recognize it and stand up for myself. And I think I definitely, when somebody mispronounces my name now, I definitely take a moment to stop them,
Yeah.
correct them. And it doesn't have to be disrespectful. Like if I mispronounced Mary Kate, I would fully expect you to tell me, hey, this is not what I like.
Yeah.
Or please call me MK.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't take offense to that. So I don't think that it should be offensive to anyone if they are corrected. And honestly, it's okay to admit that you can't pronounce it. There's names I can't pronounce.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen some languages? They're very difficult. I don't follow like English phonetics, so we understand them. So
And I learned something a few years ago, working with college students from varying diverse backgrounds, of saying something like, names are really important to me and I want to make sure I get it right. Could you help me here? And just something as simple as that, just
carries so much weight.
yeah, yeah, because
So much weight.
names are so important. And that moment that an educator or a colleague does not take the extra 5 seconds, you don't forget that. I mean, I remember in classrooms having educators say, oh, your name is too hard talking to someone with a difficult, for them, a difficult name. I'm going to call you JJ. And they, in the moment, create a name for that person, completely erasing and at the same time making hyper visible that person's difference. And it watching, and I'll never forget the moment that happened in the classroom, and that student just shrank. I mean, you can't ever show up as yourself in a setting like that.
And it normalizes it for those around them in that room to make fun of their name or, ask if they can call them a nickname.
Yep.
And that's ultimately not anyone's decision, but the individual's.
That's right.
So
yeah, it's fascinating too, your story about kind of your journey to the Kansas City area. I was noting how a lot of it resonates for me. So being born in Boston, 6 weeks after I was born, we moved to Puerto Rico. Lived in Puerto Rico for the first 3 years of my life. My dad was a search and rescue helicopter pilot, and then we moved to San Diego. And so I was surrounded by language that was not my home language from a very, very early age. I was the immigrant, absolutely. And moving to San Diego, it was just normal. We learned Spanish half the day in school. Well, we didn't even learn Spanish. We were taught in Spanish. It wasn't like, oh, you're in a Spanish as a second language school or something like that.
it was just a bilingual education.
It was a bilingual education, and it was what it was. It was so normal. It was normal. And so I was surrounded by difference. And for me, that didn't feel different because it was just what it was at the time. And it wasn't until we moved to the Midwest, I was about 8 years old, and we moved to a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. And it was the first time I really noticed. And as an 8-year-old, you notice, but you don't really notice.
It's just, this is your environment.
Yeah, yeah. And all of a sudden, it was like no one was speaking Spanish. No one looked really different. A lot of the kids there, their parents were from there, their grandparents were from there. And so the idea of living and understanding perspective elsewhere, it wasn't like it was in San Diego or Puerto Rico. And looking back on that, I was like, I'm thinking there was such opportunity in those moments, and it was lost oftentimes. I remember being cornered at on the playground and asked about, where are you from? How come your grandparents aren't here? And I was a kid. I was like, what do you mean, and growing up in the military, no one had their grandparents around. And so again, what was normal, I was realizing wasn't what I had experienced growing up.
What's interesting again about what you just said is the fact that once again, your story resonates with so many immigrant children. And it takes us back to this point that there is two things, right? One, there's no one size fits all for even an immigrant story because each one is unique. But two, there's such overlap if we just take the pause and the opportunity to connect and have that conversation between immigrant and non-immigrant stories. Because at the end of the day, we're all people.
That's right.
Right? Our experiences are very similar in a lot of ways. And the ways in which they're different, if we allow that opportunity for conversation, there can be an understanding and
Absolutely. Yeah.
coming together.
Yeah. And I think for me, recognizing now the privilege,
Yeah.
even in that space. Yes, my name was Mary Kate. Yes, I was embarrassed by that, but it was Mary Kate. It was very anglicized, very okay
Right.
to be. It was a safe name. It was a safe ethnic identity that people thought of when they heard Mary Kate. And even though for me it made me uncomfortable, I also am recognizing I held a lot of power and privilege in those spaces. So I want to dive into more of what you just said about not one size fits
Yeah.
all with the immigrant experience. Where does your mind go with that when you say that?
Yeah. So, the word that you just used, privilege, actually connects with me as
Mhm.
well because I am a first generation immigrant. I became a naturalized citizen in 2016, and yet my immigrant story is not relatable
Yeah.
to, a lot of the immigrant stories that you do hear in the news or that are more shared, I guess.
Mhm.
And so much so that it took me a while to even honestly recognize myself as an immigrant because I didn't have those hardships. I didn't have, we didn't come here fleeing something. My father came here for professional advancement and had a job opportunity that brought him here. And actually, we always planned to go back to India. It was, yeah, and I didn't know that until probably maybe 5 to 7 years ago. I just somewhat recently learned that. And yeah, the idea was always to come here and, you know, learn certain skills, then go back to India with his own business and have a partner in the US with the US office, and then he would run the India office. And um, that didn't happen for a multitude of reasons. Ultimately, the fact that he had 3 daughters, he thought they would have a more opportunities living in the US than back in India at the time.
Yeah.
And so he made that decision and we ended up staying. But yeah, there's no one size fits all. And I think that's also really important to talk about because
Mhm.
again, the relatability, right? My story may resonate with somebody who isn't a refugee or isn't, you know, um,
Yeah.
from the same background as myself. So
Yeah. And I think that for me gets to this concept of intersectional identities.
just so important.
Very important. And the research that I did with Turkish immigrant women in Berlin, one of the things that I really focused on was understanding how the identities of being Turkish, Muslim, women, varying levels of education, varying levels of first generation, all the way to third generation immigrant status, how that impacted how they experienced the world, and also what was made available to them or not available to them. And without that understanding of intersectional identity, we can't understand the not one size fits all concept
100%.
because we could have two people with the same ethnic identity background like the women I worked with in Germany, but their stories were so divergent from one another. And yet stepping through the world, especially in their case, the Germans that they encountered often had that one size fits all, or kind of that one picture approach of, oh, Turkish immigrants look like this, they act like this, they experience things like this. And so even if they didn't fit into that category, it was very hard for them to kind of claim their voice or their identity in that space.
Yeah. There's a story that comes to mind, and I think I shared this with you at lunch. There's been several moments that people have made comments like, "Oh, you're an immigrant? I didn't realize." Or, "Oh, but you're different," right?
Yeah.
And again, those aren't things that in the moment I recognize them for what they are, even though I'm sure they weren't necessarily with malice that they were being said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the individual themselves didn't even realize the weight that it carried.
Yeah.
But looking back on it now, I'm just like, what does that even mean?
Right.
Right? Or I still get asked, you don't have an Indian accent. Did you need me to have one? Like,
Does that make it safer for you if I stand? Yeah.
why do we need to predefine what this idea of who and what an immigrant is,
Yeah.
or even a non-immigrant is,
Right.
to your earlier point.
Yeah. My mind goes to, it's just safer to put people in predefined boxes, even subconsciously.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of interaction, storytelling, patience to sit and dismantle the bias that we carry inside. And so interacting with you, someone saying, whoa, she doesn't have an accent. Okay, what box do I put her in my mind? She's not going in this.
Yes,
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's why the storytelling aspect is so critical in that. And also the storytelling of not just one story and one person's experience,
Absolutely.
but hearing many, many, many stories, because only through that can we reset kind of those biases that we carry.
Absolutely. I read a quote a long time ago. It was, "We fear that which we do not understand." And doesn't that so perfectly
It is.
capture
Yep.
the essence of this?
Mhm.
That, that's, and I'm sure there's evolutionary reasons for that, right?
Yeah.
But at some point, we have to be smarter than that.
Yep.
Take the pause, take the time to have the conversation, to learn more. And, if anybody who knows me knows I'm a huge proponent of travel. And that's one of the reasons, because you realize how little you are and how big the world is and how many different ways of life that there are. But if you look close enough, there's so much overlap,
Yes.
and what people crave for themselves, for their families, for their communities.
Yeah.
And we need to focus on that and not
Mm-hmm.
you eat dinner on the floor. Like,
That's
that
right.
should not
That's
be
right.
the differentiator.
Absolutely. On the topic of quotes, I think a lot about, I think it was Anais Nin who said, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are.
Yeah.
And so that projection
So,
of, well, that's scary, or I don't want to interact with that, or she doesn't have an accent, so I can't put her in this box, is really about us being fearful of the things that we don't know.
yeah.
And the only thing to overcome that is to look deep inside of us, do the work inside, and then expose ourselves to opportunities to kind of dismantle that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I want to switch topics.
Okay, let's do
You
it.
shared something when you first arrived that had you really fired up. And I think it ties really well into a lot of what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to dive into the
Yeah. So
DEI.
let's do it. It has been something. So working in the industry that I do, it's about 94% male. The topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we know, I would say nationally, has been hot topic. We started seeing the movement towards dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts a couple years ago in universities and states like Florida, Texas. And having worked in higher education for a number of years, my colleagues who had jobs in higher education in those states knew that they were going to be out of a job because anything related to removing barriers for access and success for students suddenly got labeled as diversity and inclusion efforts and were moved to the chopping block. And so, unfortunately, it isn't entirely surprising where we have seen things move towards. But I think for me, the pace at which it's moved has been very alarming. And so, kind of the domino falling effect, one domino is pushed and they all start falling. And we at the National Association in my industry have had feedback about the work that we've been doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have had to dismantle the council that stood, and it's being absorbed into another council. And the discussion that happened was around neutrality. And for me, that I want to hear your thoughts before I share my thoughts, because I saw your face immediately when I said it. I want to hear.
I feel like, well, first of all, taking a step back, I think it's really important to understand, and I'm by no means an expert, right? That DEI is not just about racial diversity and inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts women.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts veterans.
Yep.
It impacts anybody who's differently abled.
Yeah.
If you are a postpartum nursing mom, it impacts you.
That's right.
I mean, it's truly anybody outside of the box of a straight white male, really.
Yep.
To some degree.
That's right.
I'm oversimplifying, but ultimately, yeah, to some degree.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. With that, how can you stay neutral?
Mm-hmm.
What does neutrality even mean other than being silent? Because I know you've got an opinion on it.
That's right. That's right.
So you're not being neutral, you're being suppressive, personally.
Yeah. For me, neutrality, I think about, a quote I heard a long time ago, and I don't know who said it, and I'm probably mixing up the exact wording, but neutrality is akin to siding with the oppressor.
Exactly.
And, choosing to be complicit and complacent, it is not a choice that I will ever make when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it isn't just about who's right in front of me. It's about the people who come after the people who were right in front of me. And in the work that I do in people and culture, the word equity is so important because there are laws that have had to be fought for, so that we have spaces for nursing moms to go to in the workspace, so that people can step away and not lose their jobs when they have their babies.
Right.
Like, women have fought for these things. And to say those things no longer, we have to be neutral in these spaces, means that the fight that's happened and the work that I do in people and culture really, it doesn't matter anymore. And for me, it matters more now.
I was just
than it ever.
I heard you at this point.
Yeah.
This is when you start fighting.
That's right. That's right. And, I've seen it even at the kind of national HR level. Last year, the National Association for HR stepped away from using the language DEI, and they replaced it with incivility and civility. And we're using masking language to step around the real issue here. And yes, there is incivility in the workplace. Yes, people do not know how to hold space for difficult conversations. All of that can be true, while also holding true that equity and inclusion and belonging are core components for any workplace.
Yeah. I think the only thing that neutrality does is protect the status quo.
That's exactly right.
And who does that benefit? It doesn't benefit the masses.
That's right. Yep. doesn't benefit the person who's trying to chip away at those things that have been blocking. It benefits the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
It benefits the one holding the keys to the castle. And that's the unfortunate thing about it is, we're seeing it in all spheres of life right now. And the decisions we make, I think we have to align with our own values and how we step into that.
For sure. There's an interesting conversation that I had with somebody that was not necessarily in support of DE&I initiatives. I think their thinking of it was more aligned with what media portrays it to be, which is truly not a complete or comprehensive portrayal. And I gave them the example, and there's a lot of data that backs this, that in the workplace, when there's teams put together and people come from different backgrounds, I'm not even talking racially, even if it's like an architect with a person who's had like a literacy background with somebody who used to be a doctor and now has, decided to leave the sciences and come into the corporate world, those teams perform better because you bring in a different perspective.
Yes.
That is, in its essence, DE&I.
It sure is. Yep.
But because we've removed this racial component,
Yeah.
it becomes safe to accept.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But all you're doing is providing opportunity for access to bring forth a different perspective.
That's right. And the result of that for the business is more innovation, bigger. If it's a company based in sales, your sales are going to go up because you have a diversity of thought, diversity of perspective in that space. And for the employee, they're going to be more deeply engaged in the work that they do. So they're going to be higher productive, fewer sick days. I mean, we see it across the board.
So much data to access and opportunities for personal growth.
That's right.
Right? Like you taught me something about this industry or background or whatever that I knew nothing about. So now I have this little nugget of knowledge that the next time I encounter something that, presents itself to align with this, it'll trigger, oh yeah, I learned this and this is what this means.
Yeah.
And now we're removing all of that.
Yep. And I think one of the other core pieces there is the safety that can be created in a space like that. And that goes back to kind of the conversation we were having earlier. In any space with any person who's different than myself, who has different identities, so that would be everyone, because we all carry different identities. It is so important for me to show up and make space and co-create a space that's trusting and safe, because otherwise I'm just projecting my beliefs of who you should be and who you should show up as into that space.
So what advice would you give others who are in this space and disheartened to see what's currently happening in their various workplaces and communities?
Yeah.
To keep on going and
recognize it's okay to acknowledge your burnout.
Yeah.
It's okay to I feel a lot of empathy fatigue right now. Because again,
I put your mask on before you can help others.
That's right.
There's a reason for that. Yeah.
And I have the privilege of saying, I'm a straight white woman who is a citizen, who is able-bodied. I am not experiencing a lot of the things that I see my peers, my friends, my coworkers going through right now. I have the ability to shut the news off. But that's my power and privilege speaking. So people don't get to step away from what's happening because it is an attack on their identity. It is the fear for their lives, for their children's lives. So I would say holding space for that is okay. Holding space for this is a lot of weight, as someone who in my company, I kind of play that first line of defense for people to come to and say, I'm struggling with this. This is really hard, or I don't know who's safe in this company. I don't know who I can talk to. I hold a lot of that. And so I would say, first of all, it's okay to feel all those feelings. Secondly, find your community, because we're not going to get through this alone. And as someone who is hyper independent, that is hard for me to say. But I have realized that there is strength in numbers. And even if it's just sitting in silence with someone who you know is safe, you don't have to talk, you don't have to do anything, but just to know that that person is there. And then if you feel safe and comfortable doing so, align with an organization that really is helping to amplify the values that you hold. So, whether it's showing up to an event or even listening to more of these podcasts, contribute in whatever way feels comfortable. Um, yeah. What would you say? Because I'm curious to hear your response to that same question.
I think a lot of what you already stated,
Yeah.
um, but just in its simplest form, we can't give up
Yeah.
because where does that take us?
Yeah.
And that can't be the answer.
Hmm.
So, in your own little way, and whatever that means to you, keep having the conversations, keep, you know, one individual can have a ripple effect. We've seen it. Our history has shown it. Starts with somebody. So,
Yeah.
as long as we continue to be inclusive and welcome people into the conversation and whatever that means for you, I don't think that it's ever going to go back to what it was, because it can't, because we are so far past that point that you can't. The status quo has changed.
Yeah.
We just haven't caught up with the change as a society or accepted it.
Yeah.
And we're fighting it. And that's going to come to a head at some point. So I still remember when I first moved to the States, one of the first things I ever learned was, America being a melting pot. And we had to do this project about, I literally cut out pictures of like, potatoes for the Irish and, whatever, whatever, whatever. I don't fully remember anymore, but to put together a collage of in an actual pot, a diagram of how it's a melting pot. We come from different backgrounds, and that's what makes us so great. I feel like we need to get back to that. Like,
Yeah.
why is that all of a sudden not a good thing?
Yeah. And I think it's, the concept of melting pot can sometimes remove people's identity and attachment and affinity to where they came from.
Yeah.
So the concept of the melting pot, when Henry Ford had the Ford plant in the early 1900s, he employed mostly immigrant workers, and they lived on site. There were schools on site, and he actually had a melting pot ceremony. And there are pictures of
Really?
literal melting pots that his employees would step into, and coming out the other side, they would be handed little American flags. And he had language courses. I mean, everything was like it was a self-contained city. And
Oh my God.
the idea was that um, they're learning Americanism through capitalism, but they're learning that they belong in they're valued, they have a community, and they belong. And so that concept of melting pot, I mean, it's so cool. I'll have to send you the pictures of it.
Please do.
Yeah, but that that has, I think, dissipated over time. And
Yeah.
some people want to just keep the ingredients. And we've seen that. I mean, studies have shown that our cities are more segregated now than ever. And that, the idea of experiencing something different usually is in food form. I'm going to go to this restaurant
Yeah.
and try this dish. And that's like the safest way that people experience culture.
Yeah.
Other than themselves.
And even then there's layers, right? Where
Yeah.
Americanized Mexican food,
Yes.
Americanized Indian food,
Yes.
or other types of Asian foods, to make it more palatable for
That's right.
that community.
That's right. Yeah.
So diluting that even.
Yeah. So in the Kansas City community, what advice would you have for, I mean, you said just keep going, but like, I'm curious to hear the impact of, in your mind, if we don't keep doing this work?
Being a mom now, my mind first goes to my son and what the following generations are going to be left with.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for them to see adults acting like adults, being accepting. Because if we aren't accepting, what are they going to learn? They don't innately know those things. My son is never on a playground, fearing going to one child who's a certain race versus another child who's a different race, or a boy versus a girl. He just finds someone interesting and darts towards them.
Yeah.
And so I think just to even keep society going in the way that we want and hope.
Yeah.
We have all of these advancements that we've made and wanting to send people to Mars and this, that, and the other. But how about we just start with being kind,
right?
And accepting.
Yeah. Here in our own community.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And it is really about those who come after us. I mean, I think about the concept of servant leadership and this idea that I'm not building it for myself, but I'm building it for those who are coming next. Yep. Yeah.
We got to think of the world we're leaving behind.
Yeah, exactly. So your last thought or piece of advice as we kind of wrap up, what do you want to leave people with?
I think for non-immigrants, because I do get this question, I wanted to ask you, but I was afraid to. Didn't know how you'd respond to it. Ask the questions. Not everyone's going to be open to it, and you need to be okay with that. That's fine. But if it's coming respectfully, ask the question. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? And so, because to me, that's an opportunity to open up dialogue.
That's such a great point.
If we just stay in our minds and are afraid to ask, you'll never know. That conversation, that door will never be opened. And who knows where it may lead. Yeah. So I think that's what I would say.
That is such a great piece of feedback. Well, I wanted to say, I had a student who said that to me.
Really?
In Oregon. She was one of my interns, and it was a program that matched students from traditionally underserved backgrounds with kind of faculty or researchers at the university. And I wanted to know all about her. I wanted to just build a relationship with her. And I was scared. I was scared to ask. I didn't want to offend her. And about maybe 3 or 4 weeks into the internship, we were driving to one of our research stations. And she said, "Katie, can I share something with you?" And I said, "Of course. What is it? Anything?" And she said, "I really, really want you to ask me questions." And she was like, "I don't know how," and she was very nervous to even say it. She was like, I want you to know who I am, and I want to get to know you. And
that can't happen.
Yes. And it humbled me. It humbled me. And because here I was in my mind thinking, I'm going to offend her. I might say the wrong thing.
And you might.
And I might.
And that's okay.
And I did a couple times. But because we had built a relationship, we knew it
wasn't coming from
That's
a place
right.
of malice.
That's right. And that was, over 10 years ago. And we still communicate. We still meet and talk. And she's now a young professional doing amazing community health work in Oregon. And I remind her of that conversation almost every time we talk. And I just thank her because that
not happened.
That was
the door that opened. That followed.
Yeah. Exactly.
Perfect example.
Yeah. So that, I don't know, that was just that resonates so much for me. Yeah. And I think on the flip side of that, my advice would be, it's okay to feel a little nervous about it.
It's not necessarily always a comfortable space.
Yeah. And I would say, especially, as a white person stepping in, asking questions, or I think there's kind of the analysis paralysis of we get in our own heads and we want to know more and we're curious or or we want to understand something, but it freezes us.
Yeah.
Like we take no action because we're in our head. That just being courageous and stepping outside of ourselves, and taking that risk to build that relationship. Yeah.
Takes both sides.
That's right. Absolutely. Co-create that relationship. And like with my student, I mean, I've learned so much from her. I continue to learn from her 10 years after that conversation. So
Amazing.
yeah. Well, Shivani, it was awesome chatting with you. Yeah. Yeah. I'd do this again sometime.
Thanks, MK.
Anytime, Shivani.